Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you love and realized that while their heart is still beating, the invisible architect of their daily life has quietly moved out? As a physician who has walked through the autumn of life with over 30,000 souls, I have learned that the most profound tragedies often begin not with a sudden collapse, but with a single, unwashed shirt. I remember a Tuesday morning in Savannah, Georgia, where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and salt, but inside a small, weathered cottage, a different, more somber atmosphere took hold. Arthur Miller, a man whose hands had once crafted the finest oak staircases in the South, sat in his favorite armchair, draped in a flannel shirt that had seen far too many days without a wash. His hair, once kept with military precision, was matted and oily, and as I sat across from him, the faint, sharp scent of neglected hygiene hung between us like a physical wall. I didn't see a man who was lazy or stubborn. I saw a master carpenter whose brain was losing the blueprints to his own existence. Arthur looked at me, his 82-year-old eyes flickering with a mixture of pride and a terrifying, unspoken confusion, as if he knew something was wrong but couldn't find the words to grasp it. It is a common misconception that seniors stop bathing because they simply don't care, but clinical research from Harvard University paints a much darker, more scientific picture. We must understand that the act of taking a shower is not simple. It is a complex sequence of executive functions managed by the prefrontal cortex, the very part of the brain that begins to thin as we age. For Arthur, the steps we take for granted, adjusting the water temperature, remembering where the soap is, the physical exertion of scrubbing, had become as overwhelming as climbing a mountain in a thunderstorm. My clinical observations over 3 decades confirm that when a senior begins to skip showers or wear the same clothes for a week, they are not being difficult. They are experiencing a failure of the brain's organizational center. In fact, peer-reviewed studies indicate that seniors who neglect personal hygiene are 3 times more likely to be in the early, invisible stages of dementia compared to those who maintain their routines. I reached out and placed my hand over Arthur's, noticing the dark crescents of dirt under his fingernails, nails that used to be kept spotless for his woodwork. "Arthur," I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of 30,000 stories. "It feels like the stairs are getting steeper, doesn't it?" He looked down at our joined hands, and for the first time, a tear carved a clean path through the dust on his cheek. He confessed that he often stood in the bathroom for 20 minutes, staring at the shower head, completely forgetting what he was supposed to do next. This is the executive decline that no one warns families about. It is the silent erosion of the self that precedes the loss of memory. Poor hygiene is a medical red flag of the highest order, as it leads to a staggering increase in the risk of skin infections, gum disease, and even aspiration pneumonia as oral bacteria find their way into aging lungs. The pain in that room was palpable, the smell of neglect being nothing more than a chemical cry for help from a drowning mind. But as a doctor, I know that where there is life, there is a path to restoration, and sometimes that path is paved with the simplest ingredients from a kitchen pantry. I didn't prescribe Arthur a heavy sedative or a complex regimen. Instead, I looked to the healing power of nature that has sustained us for centuries. I told his daughter to prepare a basin of warm water infused with 2 cups of Epsom salt and 10 drops of pure lavender oil, a natural sedative for the nervous system. Lavender has been shown in clinical trials to reduce cortisol levels by 24%, calming the sensory overload that makes bathing feel like an attack on the elderly brain. We began a ritual of sensory soothing, where the goal wasn't just cleanliness, but the gentle reawakening of his routine through scent and warmth.
6 weeks later, I returned to that cottage in Savannah, and the change was nothing short of a resurrection. Arthur met me at the door wearing a crisp white linen shirt, his skin glowing with the health of someone who had rediscovered the sanctity of the self. The musty scent of decline was gone, replaced by the faint, clean aroma of lavender and the smell of fresh cedar from his workshop. He hadn't just regained his hygiene, he had regained a sense of agency, a feeling that he was still a man worthy of care and respect. We had moved from the before, a state of stagnant, shameful neglect, to an after filled with light and dignity. It reminded me that as we age, our bodies may fail us, but our spirits can still be polished back to a shine with enough patience and the right natural touch.
Behind every forgotten toothbrush and every stained collar is a human being struggling to stay tethered to the world they once knew. We must stop looking at these slips as just getting old and start seeing them as the urgent medical warnings they truly are. If we can respond with empathy instead of judgment,
We can turn a source of family embarrassment into a life-saving intervention. Arthur taught me that medicine is not just about the heart's rhythm, but about the rhythm of the morning routine that keeps us human. As I drove away from his home, I realized that the greatest healing doesn't happen in a sterile lab, but in the quiet moments when we help a loved one find their reflection in the mirror once again.
Have you ever wondered why the world seems to get louder just as it becomes harder for us to hear it? I recall a winter afternoon in Portland, Maine, when the air was crisp enough to shatter glass. Eleanor Riggs, a woman who had spent 40 years as a librarian surrounded by the sacred hush of books, sat in my consultation room. But Eleanor wasn't whispering. She was speaking with a volume that rattled the stethoscopes on my wall. As I watched her, I didn't see someone being rude or aggressive. I saw a woman terrified of the encroaching silence that she was trying to fight with the only weapon she had left, her own voice. This is the phenomenon we call presbycusis, the progressive loss of the tiny, delicate hair cells in the inner ear that never grow back once they are gone. Because Eleanor could no longer hear the nuances of her own speech, her brain instinctively cranked up the volume, creating a silent shout that she was entirely unaware of.
Statistics from the American Academy of Audiology reveal a heartbreaking truth. Nearly 2/3 of adults over the age of 70 experience significant hearing loss, yet fewer than 20% seek help through hearing aids. For Eleanor, the social cost was devastating. She told me, her voice booming in the small room, about how her grandchildren would recoil when she spoke, or how friends at her knitting circle would exchange uncomfortable glances. She had begun to withdraw, retreating into the cold Maine woods of her own isolation, because it was easier to be alone than to be the loud woman in the room. This isolation isn't just a social problem, it is a neurological emergency. A landmark study published in The Lancet suggests that untreated hearing loss increases the risk of developing dementia by 30%. When the brain has to struggle every second just to decode muffled sounds, it diverts precious cognitive energy away from memory and thinking, leaving the mind exhausted and vulnerable. I leaned in close, ensuring Eleanor could see my lips move, and I took her hand. I didn't ask her to lower her voice. I asked her what she missed hearing the most. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, finally at a normal volume because of the physical closeness, that she missed the sound of the wind in the pines and the soft laughter of her granddaughter. To support her auditory health and the circulation to her delicate inner ear structures, I suggested a simple, warm ginger and ginkgo biloba infusion. Ginger, a humble root found in every kitchen, contains potent anti-inflammatory compounds that can help improve microcirculation to the cochlea. Within months after combining this natural support with a discreet hearing aid, the shouting Eleanor vanished, and the librarian returned. She learned to recalibrate her internal volume, and the wall of isolation began to crumble. We must understand that when our elders speak too loudly, they aren't trying to dominate the conversation. They are trying to find their way back into it through a fog of silence. Why is it that we find it so hard to let go of a plastic bag or a stack of old mail when our hearts are heavy with the fear of forgetting? I traveled to Nashville, Tennessee to visit Betty Sue Thompson, a retired school teacher who had once been the epitome of organization. Her home, however, had become a labyrinth of egg cartons, newspapers from the 1990s, and drawers overflowing with dull pencils. Her daughter was at her wit's end, calling it trash. But as a doctor who has studied the aging mind for 3 decades, I knew these weren't just objects, they were horcruxes of her soul. Clinical research from Japan highlights that hoarding in seniors is often a manifestation of loss anxiety. When the brain's frontal lobes begin to lose their edge, the ability to categorize value disappears, and every scrap of paper feels like a vital link to a past that is slipping away like sand through fingers. Betty Sue sat amidst her towers of paper, looking like a captain trying to keep a sinking ship afloat. She told me that every time she threw something away, she felt a physical pain in her chest, a sensation of losing a piece of her late husband. This isn't just clutter, it's a safety hazard that leads to thousands of falls and house fires every year among the elderly. Yet to force a cleanup is to invite a psychological breakdown. I sat with her, and we shared a cup of chamomile tea, a kitchen staple that clinical trials show can significantly lower cortisol, the stress hormone that spikes when a senior feels their environment is being threatened. We didn't clear the house in a day. We cleared 1 square foot a week, treating each discarded item with the respect of a funeral rite.
I explained to her daughter that Betty Sue's brain was using these items as anchors to keep her from drifting into the void of cognitive decline. By providing her with a small, beautiful memory box for her most precious items and using the calming ritual of herbal tea, we lowered her anxiety enough to make the home safe again. The transformation was slow but profound. The before was a woman trapped in a cage of her own history. The after was a woman who could finally walk through her hallway without fear. We must remember that for the elderly, a pile of junk is often a fortress built against the terrifying uncertainty of the future. Is there anything more bittersweet than hearing the same story for the 10th time in a single hour, told with the same breathless excitement as the first? In Cleveland, Ohio, I sat with George Whitmore, a retired postal worker whose mind was as sturdy as a weathered oak, except for one thing. He lived in a loop. George would tell me about the great blizzard of 1965, describing the height of the snow and the coldness of the wind, only to finish and start again 3 minutes later. This is the tragedy of the shrinking hippocampus. By the time we reach age 70, this vital memory center can shrink by as much as 20%, making the encoding of new memories nearly impossible, while the old memories, the ones etched deep into the neural pathways, remain vivid and bright. George wasn't trying to be repetitive. His brain simply couldn't find the stop button on the record player of his life. A study in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease indicates that frequent repetition is one of the most reliable early markers of mild cognitive impairment. George's fear, though he couldn't articulate it, was that if he stopped talking, he would disappear entirely. I watched his wife's face, etched with the exhaustion of 1,000 blizzards, and I realized they both needed healing. I recommended a simple lifestyle change, incorporating fresh rosemary and sage into their daily meals. Rosemary contains rosmarinic acid, which research suggests can inhibit the breakdown of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter essential for memory and focus. The change wasn't a miracle cure. The blizzard story still came back, but it happened less often, and George became more present in the moments between the stories. We learned to treat his repetitions not as a nuisance, but as a prayer. He was checking to see if we were still listening, if he still existed in our eyes. When we encounter the broken record of an aging mind, our job isn't to correct them, it's to listen as if it's the first time, every time, because one day the story will stop and we would give anything to hear it just once more. Have you ever noticed how a dinner table can transform from a place of joy into a source of quiet shame? In Des Moines, Iowa, I sat with Martha Higgins, a former waitress who had spent her life serving others with grace, yet now she struggled with the very act of eating. Martha's family was frustrated by her noisy chewing, the lip smacking and the occasional open-mouthed crunching that seemed so out of character for such a refined woman. But as a doctor, I saw the physiological reality behind the sounds, the weakening of the masseter muscles and the loss of oral dexterity. Research published in the Journal of Oral Rehabilitation reveals that over 40% of adults over 65 suffer from a significant decline in chewing efficiency. For Martha, the simple act of breaking down a piece of chicken felt like an athletic feat, requiring more force and wider movements of the jaw than ever before. This decline is often exacerbated by a 60% reduction in saliva production, a common side effect of aging and various medications, which turns swallowing into a painful, audible struggle. This isn't a loss of manners, it's a body losing its mechanical precision. Martha had begun to avoid eating in front of her grandchildren, fearing their judgment, which led to a dangerous path of nutritional deficiency and social withdrawal. I suggested a kitchen intervention, drizzling high-quality extra virgin olive oil over her meals to provide necessary lubrication and healthy fats, alongside gentle jaw-strengthening exercises. We must stop shaming the sounds of the aging body and start recognizing the effort it takes just to sustain life. When we hear the noisy chewing of an elder, we are hearing the sound of a survivor still fighting to stay at the table. Why do we pull away from a hug just when our elders need it most, repelled by a scent they cannot even detect? I remember visiting Evelyn in her sun-drenched home, where the faint, musty aroma of old age hung in the air like a persistent fog. Scientists call this nonanol, a chemical byproduct of fatty acids breaking down on the skin that becomes more prevalent after age 40. This scent is unique because it is not water-soluble. Soap and water often fail to wash it away, leaving seniors like Evelyn in a state of invisible stigma. Evelyn noticed her bridge group making excuses to leave early, and she began to wonder if her very presence had become offensive. This is the tragedy of sensory dulling.
As we age, our olfactory bulb loses its sensitivity, meaning Evelyn couldn't smell the alarm her own body was sounding. Clinical studies suggest that strange body odors can also be early indicators of liver or kidney stress, making them vital diagnostic tools. I didn't want Evelyn to hide her scent. I wanted her to balance it. I recommended a simple acidic rinse using a mixture of 1 part apple cider vinegar and 4 parts water after her bath to help neutralize the alkaline nonenal. We also focused on hydration, as 80% of seniors live in a state of chronic dehydration, which concentrates these odors. Within weeks, the musty cloud lifted, and more importantly, Evelyn's confidence returned. We must remember that the scent of aging is not a sign of uncleanness, but a natural biological shift that requires our help, not our distance. Is there anything more jarring than watching a vibrant soul suddenly vanish into sleep in the middle of a lively conversation? During his granddaughter's school recital, Robert, a 72-year-old former architect, suddenly drifted off, his chin hitting his chest as the music played. The audience whispered, assuming he was bored or disinterested, but I knew his brain was struggling with the twilight shift. As we age, the pineal gland produces significantly less melatonin, and the circadian rhythms that govern our alertness become fragmented. A study in sleep medicine found that over 32% of seniors suffer from excessive daytime sleepiness, often a direct result of micro-awakenings throughout the night. For Robert, his brain was simply forcing a reboot because it was starving for restorative rest. This isn't just about being tired. Researchers at Stanford have linked frequent daytime nodding to a 200% increase in the risk of developing dementia within 5 years. The brain's sleep-wake switch is wearing out, and these public lapses are a plea for neurological support. I suggested Robert try a moonlight ritual, a small teaspoon of raw honey and a pinch of sea salt before bed to stabilize liver glycogen and prevent the nighttime adrenaline spikes that ruin deep sleep. We also introduced bright light therapy in the mornings to reset his internal clock. Robert didn't need to be embarrassed. He needed to be understood. When you see a senior doze off at the dinner table, don't wake them with a jolt. Wake them with the realization that their mind is working harder than you can imagine just to stay awake. Have you ever wondered why a person who was once the soul of kindness suddenly becomes a fountain of constant complaints? Martha Higgins spent half our appointment complaining about the Arctic temperature of my office and the sour taste of the water I offered. It's easy for families to label this as grumpiness, but in my 30,000 cases, I've seen that this is often a failure of the prefrontal cortex to regulate emotional triggers. As this area of the brain thins, the ability to filter out minor irritations dissolves, leaving the senior feeling constantly under siege by the world. Furthermore, the aging body produces higher levels of cortisol in response to small stresses, and it takes much longer for those levels to return to baseline. Martha wasn't being difficult. She was living in a state of permanent physiological fight or flight. This constant complaining is often a mask for underlying depression, which affects nearly 20% of seniors but is frequently ignored. I recommended a daily golden milk ritual: turmeric, ginger, and black pepper in warm almond milk. Turmeric's curcumin is a potent anti-inflammatory that research suggests can cross the blood-brain barrier to soothe the neural inflammation often linked to irritability and brain fog. We also worked on awe walks, 5 minutes of looking at something beautiful in nature to reset her nervous system. Martha's bitterness wasn't her character. It was a symptom of a brain that had lost its cooling system. When we respond to a complaint with a hug instead of a defense, we provide the emotional regulation they can no longer provide for themselves.
How do you react when the person who raised you suddenly looks at you with eyes full of suspicion and accusations of theft? It was heartbreaking to watch Clara, a 79-year-old grandmother, accuse her own son of stealing her jewelry, only to find the items tucked away in a place she had forgotten. This isn't a choice to be crazy. It's a neurological phenomenon where the brain, unable to remember a gap in time or a misplaced object, creates a narrative of suspicion to protect the ego. When the temporal lobes decline, memory fails, but the brain's need for logic does not. Therefore, if a wallet is missing, the only logical explanation to a failing mind is that someone took it. Clinical studies show that nearly 25% of seniors in early-stage cognitive decline experience these paranoid delusions. It is a terrifying way to live, believing the walls have ears and your loved ones are enemies.
This paranoia is often worsened by untreated hearing loss and poor vision, which turns shadows into intruders and whispers into conspiracies. I explained to Clara's son that his mother was living in a horror movie produced by her own neurons. We introduced a clarity protocol, using high-dose omega-3s from fish oil and walnuts to support the myelin sheathing of her nerves, and simplifying her environment to reduce visual noise. We also focused on validation therapy, never arguing with the delusion, but comforting the fear behind it. Clara didn't need a lawyer to prove her son's innocence. She needed a son who could hold her while she was afraid of the dark. Paranoia is the ultimate cry of a mind that feels it is losing its grip on reality, and our only response must be to be the hand that refuses to let go. Why do we blush when our elders speak of things we consider private, forgetting that they are simply shedding the heavy armor of social pretense? I have seen it in countless dining rooms and clinics, a grandfather discussing his bowel movements over Thanksgiving dinner, or a grandmother describing a medical procedure to a total stranger at the bank. This loss of social filter is a direct result of the thinning of the frontal lobes, the area of the brain responsible for self-monitoring. For someone like Frank, a patient of mine who had been a stoic judge for 40 years, this shift was jarring for his family. But to Frank, it wasn't about being rude. It was a desperate, unfiltered attempt to be seen in his vulnerability. As the world becomes more confusing, the need to share one's physical reality becomes a way of taking power back from an unpredictable body. A 2019 study in aging and mental health found that seniors who feel isolated are twice as likely to overshare as a way to force a connection with others. When Frank talked about his ailments, he was really saying, "I am frightened that I am falling apart, and I need to know someone is listening." We treated Frank's anxiety not with pills, but with the simple grounding ritual of peppermint and lemon balm tea. Peppermint aids the very digestion he was so worried about, while lemon balm contains terpenes that soothe the fight or flight response in the aging brain. Slowly, Frank's conversations shifted from his symptoms back to his life because he finally felt heard. As I look back on 30,000 patients, I realize that aging is the ultimate journey of the human spirit. It is a process of stripping away the superficial until only the raw, beautiful truth remains. We have seen how hygiene slips, how voices rise, how items are hoarded, and how stories are repeated. These are not signs of a life losing its value. They are the quiet, often unpleasant alarms of a body and mind that are tired and in need of grace. None of these changes mean that dignity has to be lost. In fact, dignity is something we give to them through our patience, our empathy, and our willingness to look past the embarrassing behavior to the person inside. My dear friends, if you have noticed these changes in yourself or a loved one, do not hide in shame. These 12 unpleasant truths are merely signposts on a road we will all travel. I urge you to act today. Do not wait for a crisis to show compassion. Start the simple kitchen rituals, the lavender soaks, the rosemary seasonings, the peppermint teas. These small, natural acts of love can preserve independence and self-respect far longer than any chemical intervention. Open the dialogue. Talk about the unpleasant things, because silence is the greatest isolator of all. If this journey through the heart of aging has touched you, if it has helped you see a loved one in a new light, then I ask you to join our community. Please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who is struggling in the shadows of caregiving. We read every single comment, every story of pain and hope, because your experiences are the real documentary of the human heart. Let us walk each other home with dignity. I am Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and I thank you for your trust and your time. God bless.